Let's cross to Moscow and correspondent Jake Cordell. Jake, there are going to be more talks Wednesday in Brussels, Thursday with nations of the OSCE. In this case, is it fair to say, listening to those senior diplomats, that they've broken the ice?
I think that's probably a fair assessment. Yes, breaking the ice. That there were no breakthroughs expected today, and that's exactly what occurred. The US didn't even say that these were negotiations. They just said this was both sides putting their positions on the table. And from those statements, we heard they both said it was a business-like professional meeting. The two sides talked for more than 7 hours. So substantive are the issues they need to get into. But the key issue, the key dividing issue still remains. Russia came out of the meeting saying it needs concrete legal guarantees that NATO will never expand and will never admit Ukraine and Georgia specifically as new members in the future. The US immediately, their lead negotiator, hit back on those ideas and said it would never allow any other country to close the door on a different country from joining NATO. So it's clear that there really are substantive issues between the two sides, but there are at least two more big meetings to come this week. And the US and Russia both said they would take stock at the end of the week and then discuss what happens next.
And parallel to that, there have been lower level talks that have been going on these issues outside of Ukraine when it comes to nuclear non-proliferation.
Yeah, that's right. That's one area where the two sides have come together recently. We saw a few weeks ago a rare joint statement between the US, Russia, and the other members of the UN Permanent Security Council, which said that a nuclear war should never be fought and it could never be won. And it seems maybe common sense, but the fact that the sides are able to sit down and put that statement out is a sign. The US feels in these negotiations that it can offer something in the way of nuclear non-proliferation. It said today it's ready to discuss the idea of its missile deployments in Europe and the positioning of them. That's another area of concern from Russia, is the US has a lot of missiles and military bases around Russia. That's one of the concerns we hear a lot about here in Moscow. So that's one of the areas of concession. We also saw today the Russian side coming out and saying it was ready. It said that NATO should be willing to meet it halfway in its demands. And that's something we haven't heard before. Even going into the meeting, Russia was saying there was no room for compromise. But still, we have from the US these threats of very harsh, very severe sanctions on Russia if it does step into Ukraine. So while there has been positive talk on issues of non-proliferation, the key issue of Ukraine remains.
And certainly 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border did succeed in grabbing Washington's attention. How strong Moscow's bargaining position is an open question when we'll be putting it to our panel, Jake, later in the France 24 debate. Particularly since Russia's got fires in its own backyard, what with the situation, the open revolt we saw the last 5 days in Kazakhstan, which seems to have been quelled. Which is getting more coverage where you are? The talks in Geneva or Kazakhstan?
Over the last week, it's clearly been the issues in Kazakhstan, which were really a surprise because Kazakhstan was seen as probably one of the most stable, if not the most stable, of Russia's neighbors, especially after the revolution and turmoil we've seen in Belarus, which was previously another stable partner of Russia. The other thing to mention is this issue of Ukraine. We're now 8 years after the annexation of Crimea and 8 years after the West has imposed sanctions on Russia. And that really was a very big turning point, both in Russia's foreign policy and domestic policy. So in terms of the coverage and topics we're seeing on Russian state TV, the issue of Ukraine gets mentioned, but the fact that we're 8 years into an ongoing war between Russian-backed separatists and Ukraine in the Donbass means that this issue of Ukraine is never far from the agenda anyway, so it's just been ticking over. These talks are really, in Russia and Moscow, maybe not seen as anything new or exciting, whereas the developments in Kazakhstan really were a shock, and Russia will be hoping it can quell that issue, or that issue has already been quelled in Kazakhstan, and it can now divert attention back to Ukraine.
Jake Cordell in Moscow, many thanks for that live update.